Today I'm going to be talking about kinship, infertility and new reproductive technologies, and some of the questions and concerns that these raise for Christians. So in order to kind of explore some of these key questions, we need to look a little bit closer about ideas about family and reproduction, so both in contemporary society and in the Bible. And from there, I'm going to try and set out some suggestions for how Christians might try and think about and respond to new reproductive technologies. I just want to say, first of all, this is a really complicated topic, and I don't have the expertise or the time to address it comprehensively here. My specific focus in this talk is going to be the way that NRTs both expose and challenge our ideas about family. So that means I won't be addressing issues to do with the use of embryos in assisted reproduction or some of the more problematic elements of things like commercial surrogacy, which in any case isn't legal in the UK, so it doesn't happen here. I'm just going to start off with a couple of definitions so we all know what we're talking about. New reproductive technologies are also referred to as assisted reproductive technologies, or ARTs, and these are treatments developed to support those who can't conceive naturally. So that could be individuals with fertility problems, inherited genetic disorders, same-sex couples, individuals who want to have children and don't have a partner. They encompass a whole variety of treatments, but today I'm going to focus on two specific kinds of NRT with relevance for the family questions I'm going to talk about. So those are gamete donation and surrogacy. Gamete donation is the donation of either sperm or eggs to those who wish to conceive a child but are unable to provide either one or both of those gametes, or could be at high risk of passing on an inherited disease. And surrogacy involves the use of another woman's womb to carry a child. So in the UK, both gestational surrogacy and genetic surrogacy are legal. Gestational surrogacy involves the surrogate carrying an embryo which is not genetically related to her. So it'll be an egg and a sperm donated from other people. And genetic or traditional surrogacy is where the surrogate provides both the egg and gestation. Okay, so NRTs tend to raise concerns or feel really deeply disruptive to a lot of us because they go against the grain of what we feel is the norm for the conception of children and the structure of the family. Extensive research in the area of kinship studies can articulate what for a lot of us is probably just assumed without question. And that's that the norm for a family unit is a heterosexual couple living together with children produced as a result of their sexual union. Jeanette Logan, who's an expert in contemporary adoption studies, argues that the biologically related nuclear family is not only considered the norm, but is also deemed to be the basis for real family ties. And so you can kind of infer from that also like the ideal or best kind of family unit. So this is kind of our specific cultural context that we're in. These are the ideas about the family that we tend to be surrounded by. I just want to put that in a bit of wider context. So the specific iteration of the nuclear family that we find today is actually a pretty recent development, dating kind of from the Victorian era, or possibly slightly earlier. And there are many people groups across the world who conceptualize kinship really differently. So there's some examples here of people groups who don't even give blood ties the same kind of value, weight, or meaning that we assume they have. And even in the Greek, Jewish, and Roman contexts in which the Bible was written, you didn't really have the nuclear family as a freestanding social unit in the same way that it exists today. Household groups tended to be bigger and consisted of a mixture of kin and non-kin living together. So that's quite a cursory overview of how definitions of kinship can vary, but I hope it can help us set our own specific cultural understandings of family just in a bit of wider context. As is quite often the case, broader cultural beliefs are usually reflected in the church. And so many Christians believe that regardless of the culturally and historically specific nature of our ideas about family, that the nuclear family is God's ideal. These beliefs will then guide Christian responses to NRTs and other kinds of non-conforming families that don't fit the kind of biogenetically related nuclear family norm. I've just got one example here from the Christian Medical and Dental Association. So that's a US-based organization, and their guidelines that they've released for Christian use of NRTs. Obviously, we can't take this as representative necessarily of all Christian views. I think it does articulate some of the key ethical concerns that Christians have if they're coming from a place of working with the model of the biogenetically related nuclear family as the ideal. So the CMDA consider NRTs morally problematic if they involve any introduction of a third party at all. So they'll support things like IVF as long as that's using the sperm and egg of the husband and wife. But in any situation where there's donation of gametes or surrogacy, that's considered to be morally problematic as it threatens the integrity of the marriage bond. So the introduction of a third party threatens the integrity of a marriage bond. Particularly genetic surrogacy, they think is totally inconsistent with God's design. So that's having another woman both give the egg and the womb, and then the child will be raised completely separately from that woman. They do support adoption, as a lot of Christians tend to, as this emulates God's adoption of us as spiritual children, which I think reveals the concern to be not so much with families raising children who are not genetically related to them, but with the possible asymmetry created between spouses if one of them is involved in the reproductive process with the child and the other's not. And also possibly kind of the spectre or ghost of a third parent if there's been donated gametes or a surrogate involved. There are some other concerns as well to do with child welfare, particularly when it comes to surrogacy. Kind of the idea of taking a baby away from the woman who's raised it tends to raise quite a lot of concerns for a lot of people. And it comes from the idea of like a real severing of what is seen as quite a natural and innate link between a woman and the child that she bears. There is a lot of medical evidence to support this. There's bonding and attachment processes that take place while a child is in the womb. So there is definitely a kind of rupturing that takes place when a child is removed from the woman who has bared it. And I think this brings us a little bit closer to one of the key tensions that we have with new reproductive technologies. And that's the fracturing of different kinship forging processes between different individuals, when usually we would assume those would be located in the same relational context. So things like passing genetic material onto the child, gestating and bearing the child, breastfeeding a child, or caring for them throughout later childhood, all of these are highly formative, life-sustaining processes which give rise to kinship bonds. But particularly when it comes to NRTs, you see a situation where these processes are split between a number of different individuals. So one person may pass the genetic material on, but not be involved in the raising of the child. Or one woman may bear the child, but then not have any interaction with the child after birth. So you're seeing kind of fracturing of different activities, which we usually think should take place with the same people. But are these ethical concerns, which come from a place that takes the biogenetically related nuclear family as the norm, are they biblical or are they cultural, or are they both? So is there an example of the ideal family in the Bible that we can use as a model? And what does the Bible say about infertility, about kinship, about reproduction, about adoption? Again, I would love to cover the biblical material more extensively than I'm going to be able to, so I'm just going to have to briefly cover a couple of stories, just for the sake of time. I would make a strong case that there's no ideal family to be found anywhere in the Bible, from Adam and Eve through to Jesus' crucifixion on the cross. There is a whole lot of messiness and brokenness going on in the biblical narrative. God chooses to enact his redeeming purposes for humanity through a family. So that's with the Abrahamic covenant. And this is a really impressively dysfunctional family. It's full of jealousy, competition, adultery, unfaithfulness, men fathering children through multiple women whose consent is often questionable. It really doesn't conform to the ideal nuclear model. But I would suggest that the purpose of these biblical narratives is not so much to set out God's ideal for family, as to tell the story of God's relationship with and faithfulness to this family, through and in spite of its brokenness. When Abraham and Sarah no longer trust that God is going to provide them an heir in their old age, they take reproduction into their own hands and enact what is basically surrogacy, using Hagar's fertile womb to secure an heir through human intervention. The Bible doesn't really affirm or condemn this, but God does bless the child who is born from that surrogate arrangement. Ishmael is specifically blessed by God. There are a lot more biblical examples of infertility that I would like to go into, but I think what we do generally see as a pattern in the Bible is children conceived or raised outside of normal circumstances are consistently accepted by God and integrated to the biblical narrative. When we think about adoption as well, it seems quite apparent that there you have a situation where it's not in the best interest of the child to be raised by its genetic mother, and you have that with Moses. So Moses' mother knew that she couldn't ensure his survival on his own, and that the child would probably be better off if she severed the links that she had with that child. So that's one example of it not being in the best interest of the child for it to be raised by its genetic parent, and that's in the Bible. With Jesus' conception as well, we see that real asymmetry between spouses in the reproductive process. Joseph isn't really involved at all. So according to the CMDA, we have a real problem there threatening the kind of integrity of the marriage bond between Mary and Joseph, since Mary is genetically related to Jesus and Joseph is not. But what we do see is that their marriage remains strong, and that they raise Jesus together as a unit. So I think overall we see kind of a repeated message of children being a gift from God, ultimately belonging to God, and that once these lives are brought into being, however they're brought into being, God will honour them. Of course, we also have some really strong anti-family themes running through the New Testament, and the Gospels in particular, instances where Jesus suggests that we should abandon our families and abandon our family responsibilities. This reinforces the message that our ultimate loyalty is to God and to the spiritual family of believers, rather to our kin ties. So lots of different things going on. How can we draw those together and try and work out how we might respond to new reproductive technologies? I want to try and bring those different messages together by using a definition of kinship from a really famous anthropologist called Marshall Salins. So he defines kinship as mutuality of being. So that means persons who participate intrinsically in each other's existence. That can involve love and nurture, sharing food together, living from the same land, adoption, marriage. All of these processes, what they have in common is that they involve the transmission of life capacities between persons. In the same way as kinship bonds, which are predicated on birth, those things all share that life transmission. And I think this definition can help us to connect the different kind of messages that we find about family in the Bible. The 3-generational household unit, which we find in ancient Israelite society in the Old Testament, was often bound together by marriage and procreation, but the household units were also constituted as kin through things like living from the same land, working together, eating together. The new spiritual family of believers, which is described to us in the New Testament, are from a whole range of different occupations, ethnic groups, age groups, social classes, genders. And one of the most subversive acts of this new family is gathering and eating together at the same table, because that's both a mark of kinship and a kinship forging act. So we basically can understand that kinship can be constituted in many, many different ways. And children who are not genetically related to their parents are not necessarily lacking some kind of ultimate real foundation to their family bonds. Now, having kind of worked through all of those different things that are in the Bible, there is still one important thing left, which we can't really get away from, and that is lineage. Lineage is all the way through the Bible, and the New Testament starts with a really extensive lineage of Jesus, where he came from. Doesn't this kind of emphasize the importance of the bloodline? So I've basically been trying to argue that blood is not the only means by which kinship is constituted, and yet here in the Bible we have basically a kind of consistent theme which suggests that bloodline is one of the most important things. So what can we do with that? What does that really say? Again, I don't have the time to kind of unpack this properly, but I think the emphasis on lineage in the Bible is actually about the importance of continuity of narrative, and of shared memory, and the importance of those things to identity, rather than an emphasis on the primacy of blood ties. So that argument has been reinforced in a lot of research on adopted children and their searches for their birth parents. And what comes out repeatedly from those studies is that the primary concern of those children who seek to go and meet their birth parents is to fill in biographical gaps, rather than because they think they're automatically going to have a kinship relationship because of blood connection. They want a sense of continuity for themselves between their past, their present, and their future. And that's why they go and seek out their birth parents. And it's not really evidence that blood is the most real and important factor in our kin relationships. It's much more to do with story and the narrative that we have and how important that is to our identity. So I'd basically suggest that kinship is a very complicated thing, and children born through the use of NRT, so children who have quite a complex origin, who may have been born from donated gametes, and those may be from strangers, those children aren't necessarily doomed to a kind of fractured sense of self because they've been born through a non-normative reproductive process. As long as there's openness, honesty, and a shared origin story within those families for those children to draw on, they're not going to be stuck with a fractured sense of self. I just want to conclude by kind of summarizing what I think the movement of the Bible is, and the kind of narrative arc and what that says about family. And then maybe we can just sit with that and think about how that might suggest we should respond to new technologies which are developing around reproduction. Both the Old Testament and the New Testament suggest a movement by God towards gathering a new family and expanding our idea of family in the process. God's covenant with Abraham and ancient Israel is for the purpose of drawing a new family from all tribes and nations. And Jesus continues this work in his life and ministry, drawing in the marginalized, the disadvantaged, and the stranger, and gathering a new spiritual family around himself. The Bible tends to push against a narrow and exclusive notion of family, and who might belong to us, who may participate intrinsically in our lives, and therefore who could be kin.